In the spring of 1942, the island of Malta was dying. For 2 years, German and Italian bombers had pounded the tiny Mediterranean island with an intensity that exceeded the London Blitz, that surpassed the destruction of Stalingrad, that made Malta the most heavily bombed place on Earth. The statistics were numbing. More than 3,000 air raids, over 16,000 tons of bombs dropped on an island barely larger than Manhattan. Every building was damaged. Every street was cratered. Every family had lost someone. The civilian population was starving. Food stocks had dwindled to a few weeks' supply. Flour was mixed with sawdust to make it last. Goats were slaughtered, and their meat distributed in rations measured in ounces. Children developed rickets from malnutrition. Adults grew gaunt and weak, struggling to find energy for the endless work of digging through rubble, repairing damage, burying the dead. The bread ration had been cut so many times that people joked, grimly, that soon they'd be eating the ration cards themselves. The defenders were equally desperate. The RAF fighters protecting the island had been reduced to a handful of battered Hurricanes, patched together from parts cannibalized from crashed aircraft. Anti-aircraft batteries fired their last shells, then stood silent, their crews helpless to stop the bombers overhead. The submarines and torpedo bombers that had made Malta a deadly threat to Axis shipping were running out of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. The island was on the edge of collapse, sustained only by sheer bloody-minded refusal to surrender. Yet Malta mattered more than any island its size had a right to. Sitting astride the supply routes between Italy and North Africa, it allowed the British to intercept convoys carrying fuel, ammunition, and supplies to Rommel's Africa Corps. As long as Malta survived, as long as British submarines and aircraft could operate from its harbors and airfields, the Axis could not reliably reinforce North Africa. Malta's continued resistance was slowly strangling Rommel's offensive, creating the conditions that would lead to his defeat at El Alamein and the eventual Allied victory in North Africa. Hitler understood this. So did Mussolini. The Axis powers threw everything they had at Malta. The Luftwaffe's best units, the Regia Aeronautica's bombers, eventually a planned invasion force that would have dwarfed the Crete operation. They needed Malta eliminated before they could win in North Africa. And for months, it looked like they would succeed through simple attrition. The island was dying, slowly but visibly. Victory seemed inevitable. But Malta refused to die. Through courage that bordered on madness, through sacrifice that seemed beyond human capability, through luck that felt like divine intervention, the island survived. This is the story of that survival, of the pilots who flew obsolete fighters against overwhelming odds, of the convoy sailors who died bringing supplies through submarine-infested waters, of the civilians who endured bombardment that should have broken any population, and of the strategic calculus that made one small island the hinge upon which the entire Mediterranean war turned. The rock that controlled the sea. Malta's strategic importance was geographic and immutable. The island sits almost exactly in the center of the Mediterranean, 58 miles south of Sicily, 180 miles north of Libya, commanding the narrow passage between the Mediterranean's eastern and western basins. Any convoy traveling between Italy and North Africa had to pass within striking range of Malta. This made the island a natural choke point. Whoever controlled Malta controlled the central Mediterranean sea lanes. For centuries, Malta's harbors had been prized by naval powers. The Knights of St. John fortified Valletta in the 16th century, creating one of the Mediterranean's strongest fortresses. The British took control in 1800 and spent the next 140 years improving the harbors building dockyards, and constructing fortifications that made Malta a major naval base. By 1939, the island was essentially a stationary aircraft carrier and submarine base, perfectly positioned to threaten any Axis shipping in the central Mediterranean. When Italy entered the war in June 1940, Malta's position became critical. Mussolini's African Empire required constant resupply from Italy. Troops, weapons, ammunition, fuel, food, all had to cross the Mediterranean. The route was predictable and vulnerable. Convoys departing Italian ports steamed south past Sicily, then turned east toward Libya. The journey took them within 180 miles of Malta for hours, plenty of time for submarines to intercept them or for aircraft to attack. The British immediately recognized Malta's potential. Submarines based in Valletta's Grand Harbor could patrol the convoy routes. Torpedo bombers operating from Malta's airfields could strike at night when convoys were most vulnerable. Even just having Malta as a base allowed reconnaissance aircraft to spot convoys and vector Royal Navy ships to intercept them. The island transformed from a defensive position into an offensive platform. The initial results were devastating for the Axis. In the summer and fall of 1940, Malta-based forces sank or damaged dozens of supply ships. Submarines torpedoed freighters and tankers. Swordfish torpedo bombers struck convoys in darkness, their obsolete biplane design making them nearly invisible to radar. The losses mounted: fuel that never reached North Africa, ammunition that sank to the bottom, tanks and vehicles destroyed before they could be unloaded. Rommel, arriving in North Africa in early 1941, immediately identified supply as his critical vulnerability. He couldn't sustain offensive operations if his supplies kept being sunk. He couldn't maintain his tank forces without fuel. The Africa Corps' effectiveness depended entirely on maintaining supply lines from Italy. And Malta was strangling those lines. Rommel pleaded with Berlin to eliminate the Malta threat. "Without Malta," he wrote, "the Axis will end by losing control of North Africa." Hitler agreed, and the bombing began in earnest. The Blitz that never ended. The assault on Malta began modestly in 1940, with Italian bombers striking the island's dockyards and airfields. The raids were frequent but not overwhelming. The Regia Aeronautica lacked the resources for sustained campaigns, and British fighters usually inflicted losses that made the Italians cautious. But in December 1940, the Luftwaffe arrived in Sicily, and everything changed. Flieger Corps X, a specialized anti-shipping unit that had proven devastating in Norway and the Channel, established bases on Sicilian airfields just minutes flying time from Malta. These were experienced units with modern aircraft: Ju-88s bombers, He-1111s, Ju-87s Stukas. They'd perfected precision bombing techniques against ships and could deliver that precision against Malta's harbors and airfields. The tempo of raids increased immediately. By early 1941, Malta was being bombed multiple times daily. The attacks followed predictable patterns that made them no less effective for being anticipated. Morning raids targeted the airfields, cratering runways and destroying aircraft on the ground. Midday raids hit the dockyards and harbors, sinking ships and damaging repair facilities. Evening raids struck civilian areas, destroying homes and killing non-combatants. Night raids prevented any rest, kept anti-aircraft crews at their posts continuously, and maintained constant psychological pressure. The island's defenses were inadequate from the beginning. Malta had 3 airfields: Lucca, Halfar, and Takali, all visible from Sicily and impossible to conceal or protect effectively. Anti-aircraft guns ringed the harbors and airfields. But ammunition was limited and had to be conserved. The RAF fighter force at the start of 1941 consisted of obsolete Gladiator biplanes and a few Sea Hurricanes. These aircraft could intercept Italian bombers, but were outmatched by German fighters escorting the raids. The Hurricane reinforcements that arrived through 1941 helped but couldn't solve the fundamental problem. Malta was outnumbered by orders of magnitude. A typical day might see 100 or more Axis aircraft attacking the island, opposed by perhaps a dozen serviceable British fighters. The mathematics of attrition favored the attackers overwhelmingly. They could afford losses. Malta couldn't. The bombing took a cumulative toll that statistics alone can't capture. By mid-1941, there was no undamaged area on the island. Every building in Valletta showed blast damage, shattered windows, collapsed walls, roofs torn off by near misses. The 3 cities around Grand Harbor were rubble fields where neighborhoods had been. Civilian casualties mounted into the thousands, hospitals overflowed with wounded. Medical supplies ran low, then ran out. Surgeons operated without anesthesia because there was none. Amputations were performed with tools sterilized in boiling seawater because proper disinfectants weren't available. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage. Air raid sirens sounded dozens of times daily. People spent more time in shelters than in their homes. Sleep became impossible. Just as you dozed off, sirens would sound again, and you'd stumble back to the shelter for another raid. Children grew up knowing only war, only bombing, only the shelter's darkness and the crump of explosions overhead. Adults developed what today would be recognized as severe PTSD. The constant flinching at aircraft sounds, the inability to focus, the overwhelming fatigue that came from months of sustained terror. Yet the Maltese didn't break. They endured. They cleared rubble, repaired damage, buried their dead, and kept functioning. When bombs destroyed their homes, they moved into the shelters permanently, living underground in the limestone caves and tunnels that had been excavated centuries earlier. When food ran short, they stretched rations that were already inadequate. When the government called for volunteers to repair airfields or unload supply ships, thousands appeared despite the danger. This endurance became Malta's weapon, not tanks or planes or ships, but the simple refusal to surrender despite every reason to do so. Faith, hope, and hurricanes. The fighter defense of Malta in 1941-42 was a desperate improvisation sustained by courage that bordered on suicidal. The pilots were mostly young men with minimal combat experience, flying obsolete aircraft against numerically superior enemies, taking off from cratered runways under active bombardment, and landing, if they survived, to refuel and rearm before doing it again. The Hurricane was outmatched by German fighters in almost every performance category. The Bf-109F that escorted Axis bombers was faster, climbed better, and had superior high-altitude performance. In a prolonged dogfight, the Hurricane usually lost, but Malta's pilots developed tactics that played to their aircraft's strengths: tight turning ability, rugged construction, heavy armament. They avoided extended combat with fighters, instead focusing on the bombers. Dive on the formation, fire a quick burst into a bomber, break away before the escorts could react. It required discipline to resist the instinct to dogfight, to remember that destroying bombers mattered more than proving your skill against enemy fighters. The tactics worked often enough to matter. Malta's fighters shot down hundreds of Axis aircraft through 1941, forcing the Germans to divert resources to fighter escorts that would have been more useful elsewhere. Even when the fighters didn't score kills, They disrupted bombing runs, forcing bombers to jettison their loads early or miss their targets. And the presence of any fighter opposition, however outnumbered, provided psychological lift to the population below who could look up and see that someone was fighting back. But the attrition was terrible. Pilots died in combat, in crash landings on cratered runways, from exhaustion that led to mistakes. Aircraft were shot down faster than they could be replaced by spring 1942. The RAF presence on Malta had dwindled to a handful of serviceable fighters. On some days, only 3 or 4 Hurricanes could get airborne to face raids of 100-plus aircraft. The pilots flew multiple sorties daily, climbing from bombed airfields to intercept formations that outnumbered them 30-1, knowing that surviving one mission just meant flying another in a few hours. The ground crews performed miracles keeping any aircraft flying. Parts cannibalized from crashed fighters kept other aircraft. Operational engines were rebuilt using improvised tools in makeshift workshops. Damaged aircraft were patched with aluminum sheeting scavenged from bombed buildings. Fuel and ammunition were hoarded, rationed, stretched to the absolute limit. The crews worked through bombing raids under strafing attacks. While the ground shook from explosions, some were killed at their work, hit by bombs while repairing the aircraft that would fly against the bombers that had just attacked them. In April 1942, the situation became critical. The Luftwaffe, reinforced for a final push to neutralize Malta, launched Operation Fliegenhammer, Hammer Blow. For weeks, hundreds of sorties daily struck the island. The few remaining Hurricanes were overwhelmed. By mid-April, Malta's fighter defense had effectively ceased to exist. The island lay open to unrestricted bombing. Then, on April 20th, HMS Wasp, an American aircraft carrier loaned to the Royal Navy, launched 47 Spitfires toward Malta. The Spitfires, modern fighters capable of matching the Bf-109, were desperately needed, but the delivery was a gamble. The Spitfires had to fly beyond their normal range to reach Malta, and if they arrived during a raid, they'd be destroyed on the ground before they could refuel. The gamble failed. Most of the Spitfires landed during or immediately after air raids. Ground crews couldn't refuel them before the next raid began. German bombers struck the airfields, destroying many of the newly arrived Spitfires on the ground. Within 3 days, most of the reinforcement had been eliminated. Malta was dying. Operation Calendar, the second chance. Winston Churchill, watching Malta's situation deteriorate, demanded that another Spitfire delivery be attempted. HMS Wasp and HMS Eagle were recalled for a second mission. Operation Calendar launched on May 9, 1942. This time, 64 Spitfires would be delivered, and this time the preparations would be better. The Spitfires launched from the carriers at maximum range, each one loaded with a massive drop tank under the fuselage to extend their reach. The pilots were a mix of experienced veterans and new arrivals, some with minimal flying time on Spitfires, all understanding that they were flying one way into the most heavily bombed place on Earth, with no guarantee they'd survive the day. The flight to Malta took over 3 hours, much of it over open water with no navigation aids beyond dead reckoning and prayer. Engine failures would mean ditching in the Mediterranean with minimal chance of rescue. Navigation errors could mean running out of fuel before reaching land. German fighters patrolling between Sicily and Malta could intercept the formation when it was most vulnerable, far from help with no fuel reserves for combat. But the Spitfires reached Malta, and this time the reception was ready. Ground crews swarmed each aircraft as it landed, refueling and rearming it in record time. Some pilots later claimed their aircraft were ready to fly again within 9 minutes of landing, an achievement that required preparation, coordination, and crews who'd practiced the procedures obsessively. When German bombers arrived expecting to destroy the Spitfires on the ground, they instead faced 64 modern fighters climbing to intercept them. The battle that followed was fierce but decisive. The Spitfires shot down multiple bombers and fighters, and more importantly, they forced the Germans to abort raids rather than press through fighter opposition. For the first time in months, Malta had a fighter force that could meaningfully contest air superiority. The psychological impact was immediate. Pilots who'd been flying outnumbered hurricanes against hopeless odds suddenly had aircraft that could compete. Ground crews who'd watched helplessly as Axis bombers roamed overhead unmolested now saw them being driven off. The tide hadn't turned. Malta was still under intense bombardment, still starving, still desperate. But the arrival of the Spitfires in force provided hope that survival was possible. Over the following weeks, Malta's fighters inflicted increasingly severe losses on Axis raids. The Germans were forced to devote more resources to escort fighters, which meant fewer bombers per raid. The bombing continued, but its intensity declined as Luftwaffe units were withdrawn to support operations in North Africa and Russia. By June 1942, the immediate threat of Malta being bombed into submission had receded. But a different threat loomed: starvation. The island's food stocks were nearly exhausted, and without resupply, the population would starve before the end of summer, regardless of bombing. The convoys of death. Malta's survival depended on supply convoys from Britain, ships loaded with food, ammunition, fuel, and spare parts, sailing through Mediterranean waters controlled by Axis air and naval forces. Every convoy was a battle. Every convoy suffered losses. Some convoys were annihilated completely, their ships sunk and thousands of tons of supplies lost. The convoys faced threats from every direction. U-boats patrolled the Gibraltar Strait, torpedoing ships as they entered the Mediterranean. Italian submarines positioned themselves along the convoy routes. German and Italian aircraft, operating from bases in Sicily, Sardinia, and North Africa, attacked relentlessly Italian surface ships, cruisers, and destroyers, sortied to intercept convoys, forcing naval battles in confined waters where the Royal Navy's advantages in numbers and firepower mattered less. The early Malta convoys suffered catastrophic losses. Operation Harpoon in June 1942 saw only 2 of 6 supply ships reach Malta, both damaged, carrying barely enough supplies to feed the island for a few weeks. Operation Vigorous, launched simultaneously from Egypt, was turned back before reaching Malta at all. Forced to retreat after overwhelming Axis attacks sank or damaged most of the convoy. These failures brought Malta to the edge of collapse. By August 1942, food stocks had dwindled to a few weeks' supply at starvation rations. Then came Operation Pedestal, the largest, most heavily escorted convoy ever sent to Malta, and one of the costliest naval operations of the entire war. 14 merchant ships departed Gibraltar on August 10, 1942, escorted by 2 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, 7 cruisers, and 32 destroyers. The escort was unprecedented in strength, reflecting both Malta's importance and the certainty that the convoy would be attacked with everything the Axis could bring. The attacks began before the convoy reached Sicily. U-boats torpedoed the aircraft carrier HMS Eagle, sinking her with heavy loss of life. The surviving carrier's fighters shot down numerous Axis aircraft. But the attacks continued. Bombers diving through anti-aircraft fire, torpedo bombers approaching at wave-top height, submarines maneuvering for firing positions. The escort fought desperately to protect the merchants. But the losses mounted. Ships were torpedoed, bombed, set ablaze. Some exploded when their ammunition cargoes were hit. Others burned for hours before sinking, their crews abandoning ship into oil-covered water while the battle continued around them. By the time the convoy approached Malta, only 5 merchant ships remained afloat, all damaged. One, the tanker SS Ohio, was barely under control. Torpedoed, bombed, on fire, her back broken, she was kept afloat only by destroyers lashed to her sides, supporting her hull. Her cargo, 10,000 tons of desperately needed fuel oil, was the difference between Malta continuing to operate submarines and aircraft, or being unable to conduct offensive operations. Ohio had to reach harbor. The Ohio limped into Grand Harbor on August 15th, 3 days after most of the convoy had arrived. With destroyers still supporting her shattered hull, Maltese civilians lined the harbor walls and cheered as the crippled tanker was brought in. Ground crews began pumping fuel from her tanks immediately, working around the clock to empty her before she sank. The fuel she delivered, barely a third of what Malta needed, would last perhaps 6 weeks at strict rationing. But it was enough. Combined with the supplies from the other 4 surviving merchants, Pedestal delivered just enough for Malta to survive until the next convoy could be attempted. The cost was terrible. Of 14 merchant ships that departed Gibraltar, only 5 reached Malta. 9 were sunk. The Royal Navy lost an aircraft carrier, 2 cruisers, and a destroyer. 9 other warships were damaged. Hundreds of sailors and merchant seamen died, torpedoed, burned, drowned, killed in explosions. For the supplies delivered, roughly 30,000 tons, perhaps 2 months' worth of survival rations. The price in lives and ships was staggering. But Malta survived, and in surviving, it remained capable of striking Axis supply convoys heading to North Africa. The Underground War. While the aerial battle raged overhead and convoys fought to reach the island, Malta's offensive forces conducted a different kind of warfare. Submarine and air attacks against Axis supply lines, and these operations, launched from bases carved into Malta's limestone cliffs and hidden in underground facilities, were the reason the Axis needed to neutralize Malta in the first place. The submarine base at Manuel Island became one of the most effective anti-shipping operations of the war. British submarines, mostly of the U-class, small boats designed for Mediterranean operations, operated from Malta's harbors, patrolling the routes between Italy and North Africa. The submarines would depart Malta, transit submerged to avoid air attack, then position themselves along known convoy routes and wait. When convoys appeared, they'd attack with torpedoes, often achieving multiple hits before diving deep to escape the escorts. The conditions were difficult beyond anything normal submarine operations encountered. The Mediterranean's clear water made submerged submarines visible from the air at depths that would have been safe in Atlantic operations. Axis anti-submarine forces were numerous and experienced. Air patrols constantly hunted British submarines, attacking with depth charges and bombs. Italian destroyers, equipped with sonar and depth charges, pursued any submarine that betrayed its position. Many British submarines never returned from patrol, sunk by escorts, by aircraft, by mines, or simply disappeared for unknown reasons. Yet the submarines persisted. Through 1941 to 42, Malta-based submarines sank hundreds of thousands of tons of Axis shipping. Fuel tankers, ammunition ships, troop transports. The losses were catastrophic for Rommel's supply situation. At times, more than half the supplies departing Italy for North Africa were sunk before arrival. This forced the Axis to send more convoys, which meant more targets, which meant more losses. The cycle was unsustainable, but Malta's submarines made it unavoidable. The airstrikes were equally effective. RAF torpedo bombers, mostly Bristol Beauforts and later Bristol Beaufighters, attacked convoys at night and dawn. When visibility favored the attackers, the Beaufort was obsolescent by 1942, slow and vulnerable. But its torpedo armament made it deadly against ships. The attacks required tremendous courage. Flying low over water, often in darkness or twilight, approaching heavily defended convoys, releasing torpedoes at point-blank range, then escaping through walls of anti-aircraft fire. Many crews died on these missions. The Beaufort's vulnerability meant that even minor damage could prove fatal. A single hit could set it ablaze, destroy a control surface, or kill the crew. The squadrons experienced casualty rates approaching 50% over extended periods. Yet they continued flying because the mission mattered more than the risks. Every ship sunk was fuel that wouldn't reach Rommel, ammunition he couldn't use, troops that wouldn't reinforce his front line. The combination of submarine and air attacks from Malta created an attrition rate the Axis couldn't sustain. By mid-1942, Italian merchant marine captains were refusing to sail to Libya because the odds of surviving the voyage were so poor. The few ships that did sail required massive naval escorts that diverted Italian warships from other duties. The entire Axis logistics system in the Mediterranean bent around the need to get supplies past Malta, and increasingly, they failed. This was why Malta mattered strategically. The island's location allowed it to interdict Axis supply lines in ways that no other British base could. Alexandria was too far east. Gibraltar was too far west. Only Malta sat astride the critical supply routes, and only by holding Malta could the British effectively strangle Rommel's offensive capability. Starvation as strategy. By summer 1942, Malta's military effectiveness was being undermined not by bombing, but by starvation. The population was down to 1,500 calories per day. Barely enough to sustain life, certainly not enough for the physical labor required to keep the island functioning. Civilians grew weak, unable to work full shifts clearing rubble or repairing damage. Military personnel lost weight and strength, affecting their ability to perform duties that demanded physical fitness. The bread ration, which had been cut repeatedly, was reduced to 10 ounces per adult per day. About 3 slices of bread, often made with flour adulterated with sawdust or ground-up carob pods to stretch the supply meat, was almost non-existent. The few goats that hadn't been slaughtered were kept to provide milk for children. Vegetables were grown in any available space, in bombed-out buildings, in shell craters, on rooftops. But the yield was minimal, and the soil was contaminated with explosives residue. Children suffered the most visible effects of malnutrition. Cases of rickets and scurvy appeared, diseases that had been virtually eliminated in Britain decades earlier. Children's growth was stunted. Infant mortality rose. Schools struggled to function when students were too weak to concentrate. Some families made impossible choices about who received the limited food available, giving more to children at the expense of adults, or giving more to working adults at the expense of elderly or infirm family members. The military situation was equally grim. Aircraft couldn't fly without fuel, and fuel was almost exhausted. The few supply ships that reached Malta couldn't carry enough to rebuild stocks that had been depleted by months of operations. Submarines remained in harbor because there was no fuel for patrols. Aircraft sat on dispersal areas, and fuel was almost exhausted. The few supply ships that reached Malta couldn't carry enough to rebuild stocks that had been depleted by months of operations. Submarines remained in harbor because there was no fuel for patrols. Aircraft sat on dispersal areas, Because flying them meant burning fuel that couldn't be replaced, anti-aircraft batteries conserved ammunition by not firing at some raids, saving shells for attacks against critical targets. The Axis strategy shifted accordingly. Instead of trying to bomb Malta into submission, they attempted to starve it into surrender by sinking every supply convoy if Malta couldn't be fed. It would have to capitulate regardless of military resistance. The strategy nearly worked. By August 1942, British planners estimated that Malta would starve by October if no supplies arrived. Plans were developed for evacuating essential personnel, though how this would be accomplished with Axis forces controlling the surrounding sea wasn't clear. Then Pedestal survivors limped into Grand Harbor, and starvation was postponed. Not prevented, just postponed. The supplies Pedestal delivered would last weeks, not months. More convoys would be needed. But Pedestal proved that convoys could reach Malta despite Axis opposition, and that proof mattered psychologically as much as the supplies themselves. Malta would survive, because Malta refused to surrender. And as long as it refused to surrender, someone would find a way to feed it. El Alamein and the turning point. While Malta starved, its continued operation was strangling Rommel's offensive in North Africa. The fuel and ammunition he needed to continue his advance toward Egypt simply weren't arriving in sufficient quantities. Tankers were sunk by submarines. Supply ships were bombed by Malta-based aircraft. The convoys that did get through arrived with a fraction of what they'd departed with, forcing Rommel to ration fuel so strictly that his armor often couldn't maneuver effectively. By October 1942, when Montgomery launched the Second Battle of El Alamein, Rommel's supply situation was critical. His tanks were short of fuel, his infantry lacked ammunition, his artillery was rationed to limited shells per day. The Afrika Korps was still formidable, but it was fighting with one hand tied behind its back, and Malta had tied that hand. The correlation between Malta's survival and El Alamein's outcome is direct and documented. German and Italian records show that supply shortfalls caused by Malta-based interdiction directly impacted Rommel's operational capabilities. After the war, German commanders acknowledged that Malta's continued resistance had been decisive. If the island had fallen, if the supply routes had been secure, the outcome in North Africa might have been different. Malta's effectiveness increased after Pedestal because the fuel delivered allowed submarines and aircraft to resume full-scale operations. In the months following Pedestal, Malta-based forces sank an increasing percentage of Axis shipping. By November 1942, the sinking rate exceeded 50%. More than half of all supplies shipped toward North Africa were being lost. This rate was unsustainable. It meant the Afrika Korps couldn't replace losses, couldn't maintain offensive operations, couldn't even defend effectively when Allied forces began their advance after El Alamein. The strategic calculus that had made Malta valuable in 1940 had been proven correct by 1942. The island's position made it a choke point that the Axis couldn't bypass and couldn't afford to ignore. Every resource devoted to attacking Malta was a resource not available for other operations. Every convoy diverted to supplying Malta's defenders was a convoy that couldn't supply Rommel. The Axis faced an impossible choice: continue attacking Malta and waste resources that were needed elsewhere, or ignore Malta and accept that their North African forces would be slowly strangled. They chose to continue attacking, and in doing so, they failed at both objectives. Malta survived. Rommel's forces were strangled anyway, and the entire Mediterranean campaign shifted toward Allied victory. The George Cross and recognition. On April 15, 1942, King George VI awarded the George Cross to the island of Malta and its people. The only time in history this decoration was awarded collectively to a civilian population. The citation recognized the heroism and devotion of the people of Malta, who had endured long months of continuous air attack with remarkable fortitude. The award was more than symbolic recognition. It was acknowledgement that Malta's survival depended as much on civilian endurance as military resistance. The dock workers who unloaded supply ships under bombardment, the medical personnel who treated casualties without adequate supplies, the families who shared meager rations with neighbors, the children who grew up in shelters and never complained. All of these contributions mattered as much as the pilot's skill or the submarine crew's courage. The George Cross remains Malta's most treasured honor, displayed prominently on the national flag. It represents not victory, but survival. The fact that when everything suggested surrender, when starvation and bombing should have broken any population, the Maltese endured. They endured because they understood, perhaps better than distant strategists, that Malta mattered, that their suffering had purpose, that every day they held out was another day. The Axis couldn't supply North Africa effectively. This understanding sustained them through the worst periods. When the bombing was most intense, when food was almost gone, when casualties mounted into thousands, the knowledge that their resistance mattered gave meaning to the suffering. They weren't just victims being bombed. They were participants in a strategic contest where their endurance was a weapon as effective as any submarine or fighter aircraft. The miracle that wasn't. Malta's survival is often described as miraculous, but the word obscures more than it reveals. There was nothing supernatural about Malta's defense. It was accomplished through specific decisions, concrete actions, and enormous sacrifice. The miracle was that these elements aligned sufficiently to produce survival against odds that should have been insurmountable. The defense required the right aircraft, Hurricanes that could be supplied in sufficient numbers early, then Spitfires when the hurricane proved inadequate. It required pilots willing to fly against overwhelming odds. It required ground crews who could keep aircraft operational despite shortages of everything. It required submarines and torpedo bombers striking Axis convoys despite terrible losses. It required convoy sailors willing to sail into the Mediterranean, knowing that most ships might not reach Malta. It required civilians enduring bombardment that exceeded anything London had faced. Most critically, it required these elements to persist simultaneously and continuously. If the fighter defense had collapsed before Spitfires arrived, the island would have fallen. If convoys had stopped attempting to reach Malta, starvation would have forced surrender. If the civilian population had broken, if the dock workers had refused to unload ships under bombing, if medical staff had fled rather than treating casualties, any of these failures would have doomed the island. That none of these failures occurred is remarkable, but not miraculous. Each represented human decisions to continue, despite every rational reason, to stop the pilots who kept flying when they were outnumbered 30-1. The sailors who kept sailing when previous convoys had been annihilated, the civilians who kept working when bombing should have driven them into shelters permanently. These weren't miracles. They were choices, made thousands of times by thousands of people who understood that stopping meant defeat. Legacy written in stone and blood. Malta survived, and in surviving, changed the war's course in ways that rippled far beyond the Mediterranean. The diversion of Luftwaffe resources to attack Malta meant fewer aircraft available for the Eastern Front, where the Germans were fighting for survival. The loss of supplies to Malta-based submarines and aircraft weakened Rommel at the precise moment when Montgomery was preparing the offensive that would drive Axis forces from North Africa. The delay in eliminating Malta prevented the Axis from using it as a base for their own operations against Allied convoys and eventually against the invasion of Sicily. The strategic lessons influenced post-war military thinking. Malta demonstrated that geographic position could multiply the effect of limited forces. A small number of submarines and aircraft, operating from an ideally positioned base, had impact far exceeding their numbers. It showed that civilian morale was a military factor that couldn't be ignored. Populations that refused to break constrained what military force could achieve through bombing alone. It proved that defensive endurance could be as strategically valuable as offensive success. For the people who lived through it, Malta remained sacred ground. The memorials and museums scattered across the island commemorate not victory, but survival. The siege bell in Valletta tolls daily at noon, marking the moment when raids were most frequent. The war rooms carved into the limestone beneath Valletta, where operations were directed, are preserved exactly as they were in 1942. The cemeteries where thousands are buried stand as testament to the cost. Today, Malta is prosperous, peaceful, a tourist destination known for sunshine and beaches rather than bombing and starvation. The scars remain. Buildings still show damage. Bomb shelters are scattered throughout the island. Unexploded ordnance is still occasionally discovered. But the physical scars are minor compared to the psychological legacy. The generation that endured the siege carried those memories for life, and they passed the stories to their children, who passed them to theirs. The miracle of Malta wasn't divine intervention. It was human endurance pushed beyond what should have been possible, sustained by understanding that their suffering had purpose, and that surrender would betray everyone who'd already died. It was pilots who flew when flying should have been suicide. It was sailors who kept sailing when the Mediterranean was a graveyard. It was civilians who kept living, kept working, kept hoping when hope seemed irrational. Malta survived because Malta refused to die. That refusal, stubborn, bloody-minded, sustained through months when defeat seemed inevitable, stopped Hitler's advance in the Mediterranean as surely as tanks and artillery. Sometimes, the most important victories are defensive. Sometimes survival itself is triumph. And sometimes a small island becomes the hinge on which entire campaigns turn, not through strength, but through refusal to surrender, when everything suggests surrender is rational. That's the miracle of Malta. Not that it was saved by divine intervention, but that ordinary people made extraordinary choices daily for 2 years, and those choices accumulated into strategic victory. The island that shouldn't have survived did survive, and in surviving, helped win the war. Thank you for watching and listening. We really appreciate it. Please consider subscribing, liking, and even sharing this video.